Hello, everyone. Welcome to the U.S. Civil War in Excruciating Detail podcast. I'm Will, someone with a interest in the Civil War, but not enough to do the research. So joining me is someone who is willing to do the research, my buddy Steve.
Hello, I'm Steve. I am not a historian. Don't even actually have a college degree. However, what I am is autistic. And as a result, when I find a topic or a subject that I am especially interested in, I research it into oblivion until I've learned as much as I can to keep holding my interest. And then I move on to some other obsession usually, but this one stuck around for a while. So, yeah, so I'm here to pass on the knowledge that I've gained through my unhealthy coping mechanisms.
That's one way to do it.
Yeah, I think so.
All right, so Steve, what are we going to be discussing in this episode?
Well, today last time, we laid the foundation for any discussion regarding the Civil War in discussing the myth of the lost cause. We didn't discuss it in nearly enough detail. It's really hard to do in, an hour and 15 minutes, whatever the runtime of episode 1 ended up being. So we didn't cover it nearly enough, but we got it started. And before we actually get into what today's discussion is going to be about, I have a list of corrections that I want to make for some things that I said in episode 1, where when we were reviewing the footage and we were playing it back, I'm sitting there listening like I'm learning it, and I'm going, no, that's not right. No, that's definitely not right either. And, some of the things I caught in situ and tried to correct, others just completely blew past me, and I didn't realize until we were in post. So I want to get those out of the way first. So in episode 1, when we were talking about the general attitude of Americans in the 19th century as a whole, largely viewing themselves as superior because they're white, and that because they were white and they were this advanced culture, this advanced, more capable race, that led to a prevailing thought of it's our responsibility to save the lesser races from themselves. And I had attributed a quote to Teddy Roosevelt, where I said he was quoted as saying, "It is our responsibility to help our little brown brothers." Specifically, he was, I said in the quote, he was talking about the Filipinos during the American colonial period. Well, I wasn't sure if that was Theodore Roosevelt. I had it in my mind that it was, but I went back and I checked. It was not Theodore Roosevelt. It was actually William Howard Taft. When he was, I believe, Secretary of State. This was still the 1890s. But that little brown brother term was coined by Taft. Roosevelt didn't say it, though he did agree with it. Another thing I said, where it was a little bit of a tangent, where I was like, I said Britain, and then I was like, well, actually, no, it was the United Kingdom at the time, blah, 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 blah. That was partially true. So I had said, I think we were talking about I think we were talking about the 1830s. I don't remember specifically where it was, but I had said the United Kingdom had become the United Kingdom in the 1730s. It did not. It actually became the United Kingdom officially in 1801, when the Kingdom of Great Britain united with the Kingdom of Ireland. So the Kingdom of Great Britain naturally consisted of England, Wales, and Scotland. You know, the island of Great Britain was one kingdom, Kingdom of Great Britain, but it wasn't until 1801 that the Kingdom of Ireland was absorbed into the Kingdom of Great Britain, thus beginning the United Kingdom. So I got that wrong. At one point when I was talking about Woodrow Wilson, I said 1812. I meant 1912. And when I spoke about Native Americans going into plantations, I meant reservations. And that was one of those slip-ups where I know for a fact in the moment I heard reservations, and it wasn't until we were in post that I realized I had said plantations, and I went, oh, that's not right.
Yeah, those are different things.
Right, those are very different things. And then the last two things I want to correct from episode 1, and I'm sure there's more. I'm sure people are going to point them out to me, and I welcome it. You know, we're all here to learn. Like, that's the point. When I said, when I was talking, when you had asked the question about Generals Jubal Early and James Longstreet being lieutenants under General Lee, I had said that, yes, they were lieutenant generals, and then I went, oh, wait, no, lieutenant general wasn't really a thing, so, you know, they were major generals, but they were his lieutenants, blah, blah, blah. I got that because I had most recently been looking at Union Army ranks, and that was true for the Union. It was not true for the Confederacy. So Jubal Early and James Longstreet were, in fact, lieutenant generals. Robert Lee was a general. So the Confederate Army actually had 4 general ranks: brigadier, major, lieutenant, and general. But they only had 1 rank insignia for all of them. They all had the same insignia, which was 3 stars with a larger star in the middle, surrounded by a wreath. And so if you look at any picture of any Confederate general, with the exception of Robert E. Lee, and you look at their rank insignia on their collars, you'll see 3 stars with a wreath around it, indifferent of whether they were a brigadier general or a major general or a lieutenant general or whatever. Robert Lee, very famously, only wore the 3 stars, which was the equivalent of a Confederate colonel's rank. And he was actually asked about this at one point during the war, mind you. But he was actually asked about this, and he said that because the highest rank he had held in the United States Army was colonel, he would not, even though he was a general in the Confederate Army, he would not wear a general's rank until Confederate victory was obtained. I'm paraphrasing, that isn't the exact quote, but, you know, that was his stance, was, I will not allow myself to wear the rank of general in the Confederacy until we've won. And that also kind of fed into this whole, you know, aristocratic gentleman officer thing, you know, this noble, chivalrous, honorable, you know, image.
Yeah, it's an ironically noble thing for a trader to do.
Yeah, a slaveholding trader at that. Oh, I'm sorry. Three last things. We covered one. Now there's two. I had said that Ulysses Grant was made the commander-in-chief of all U.S. Army field armies in 1864, and that I want to explain why I said that, because it wasn't technically true. So at the time, the President of the United States was still the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. The position Grant held at that time, that he was appointed to when he was promoted to lieutenant general, was general-in-chief of all Union field armies. However, in his memoirs, Grant refers to himself as the commander-in-chief of all Union field armies. So that's why that had stuck in my head. Chief of all U.S. field armies, military divisions, and departments, blah, blah, blah. Basically, top dog in the Army, one step below the civilians. And then, lastly, we finally get to the last thing. I just wanted to correct some numbers that I had a little wrong with regards to organizational unit strengths within the Union and Confederate armies.
Okay.
I believe I had said that
we'll mention how we'll go into a little bit more detail on how the armies were set up and equipped as we progress into the actual fighting.
Yeah, 100%. We're going to go much more into detail when we get to that point. But I said it wrong then. I didn't correct myself then. So I want to correct myself now. So in episode 1, I had said that a regiment was something like 500 men. And again, that was kind of a half-truth. So a regiment was the most basic tactical and administrative unit in both armies. There were organizational levels below that, though, because a regiment was defined as exactly 10 companies. But if you had less than 10, that was considered a battalion. And then you had the company, which is the smallest organization level in a broad sense. And a company was typically 75 to 100 men and commanded by a captain. Battalions were 500 to 900 men, typically. And they were commanded by either a major or a lieutenant colonel. But then getting on to the ones that I had specifically talked about in the previous episode, your regiments were authorized 1,000 men. That was the authorized amount. They almost never achieved that through various reasons, sickness, casualties of battle, desertions. So the average was about 450 to 800 men was what you would typically expect out of a regiment. And then brigades were the step above that, were 2 to 12 regiments, and then you had divisions, which were 2 to 6 brigades, and you had corps a little bit later in the war. There weren't any U.S. Army corps in the beginning, but I think it was 1862. They did a little bit of restructuring, which introduced the corps system, and so then you had corps, which were 2 to 6 divisions, and then you had armies, which were 2 or more corps. So everything just kind of scales up from there, and when we actually talk about this in depth, we'll go over, what the number of authorized personnel was for each and how it was comprised and all the different little bits and bobs that went into making it a thing. But that's the basics of it. And because I had gotten that wrong in episode 1, I wanted to make sure that on the front of this episode, we got those taken care of. And I do want to make this a thing.
We want to cover our errata.
Right. And I just so happened to kick the camera looking at you as you're talking. Great. Way to go. I'm a professional. What can I say? But yeah, no, that's something I want to do, try and do at the beginning of every episode is things that I catch that are completely wrong, things that you may catch, things that you guys watching and listening may catch and point out. I want to at least make an effort to correct those at the beginning of the next episode. Within reason. Like if I completely drop the ball and like just get everything wrong for like an hour,
we can always take that episode back down.
Right. Yeah. We'll just do that. We'll take it down, reshoot it, and then put it back up like nothing ever happened. And then anybody who comes in afterwards is none the wiser.
And we just gaslight them until they go away.
Right. Yeah, oh man, I can hear the viewer numbers dropping precipitously.
Plummeting.
But okay, so what we're going to talk about today, we started with the Lost Cause. We started laying that foundation. And what I want to do today is continue building that foundation. And the most important way to continue doing that, I feel, is to go back to the beginning of the United States and look at where and look at how is more accurate. Look at how the sectionalism within the country was ostensibly there from the beginning. That it was technically the United States after 1787. The name of the country was the United States. However, as is with most things, the reality doesn't necessarily match what it says on the tin. And so I wanted to kind of pseudo title this episode Sowing the Seeds, because for the next several episodes that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be talking about how the seeds that eventually grew into the Civil War were planted very early on. And my focus today, I'm going to try and get through all of this in one episode. I don't know if it's going to happen. So for those of you in the future, if you see like part 1 at the end of this, you'll know that I didn't manage it. But what we're going to be talking about today, what I'm going to start with today, is the economy. Because in the early days of the United States, you had two competing economic theories in the United States. You had the Jeffersonian, you had the Jeffersonian model economy, and you had the Hamiltonian model economy. Jeffersonian, obviously named for Thomas Jefferson, who was its big, he was the progenitor, he was its big proponent, it was his ideas. And then Hamilton, obviously, Alexander Hamilton, was the progenitor of his. So this is really where the North versus South dichotomy began to show. It had always kind of been there, even going back into the colonial era, but it wasn't as big of a deal before the Revolutionary War because they were all separate colonies. Yeah, they would work together, but they were still like their own administrative thing. But then after the Revolution, when they had to come together, it was one of the big reasons the Articles of Confederation failed so spectacularly. Was the North and South wanted very different things. And so then the Constitutional Convention of 1787 comes around, and the Constitution is basically a document comprised entirely of compromise over and over and over and over again. And over the course of the next several episodes, we're going to go into more detail on that.
We're going to see that these kind of compromises don't generally work very well.
Right. So I want to start with Jefferson. So he was a Virginian. He was a landed aristocrat. He was born into that. He was, his family owned slaves before his birth. He owned slaves himself once he was independent in his own right. He vehemently believed in the value of the American farmer, the rugged individualism on the frontier, where you're responsible only for yourself. He believed that the nation's best way forward was to build up an agrarian society, and that the real value in a society comes from what you can produce with your own hands, your own hard work. Personally, I find this a little ironic, given who said it.
Yeah, what you can produce using someone else's hard work.
Right. It's a bit of a tangent, but it's kind of a theme I've found in history where the people who have to work the least are the ones that are the loudest in proclaiming the value of hard physical work.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense because they get a lot of value out of very little work.
Exactly. And so, in addition to all of these things, believing that working the land with your hands was more valuable than developing machines to produce finished goods, the Jeffersonian agrarians, for lack of a better term at this stage, were just adamant that a central national bank would be a disaster. They believed that, the local community was where America was going to be built. And that if you start centralizing things within the federal government, then that is a precarious slope. He was strongly backed by the agrarian class, predominantly white Southern slave owners, but not just Southern. There were slaves all over the United States at this time. So he was predominantly backed by them, and this system, his Jeffersonian system, would eventually become the foundations of the Democratic Republican Party. Now, at the time, it wasn't called that because this is, the early 1790s, and George Washington was president, and he was famously anti-political party. So they didn't really name themselves as such until like 1798. Roughly 2 years after George Washington left the presidency and John Adams had become president. The Democratic Republicans, became a thing in name. The primary tenets of the Jeffersonian system was that farmers are the chosen people of God. That's a direct quote. He truly believed that. He said an individual's right to work for their own subsistence is the pinnacle of what freedom is, what liberty is. It's your right to take care of yourself and your land, and nobody, especially the government, should be able to tell you otherwise. He believed that the expansion of industry and trade would lead to a class of wage laborers that were dependent on others for their income and their sustenance instead of being dependent on themselves. And as a result of this, as a knock-on effect, he believed that this would make people vulnerable to political coercion and to exploitation by business owners. He believed
There's
that
kind of an irony there.
we're getting to that. He also said that the federal government should accomplish nothing that individuals at the local level could feasibly accomplish. Very small government, very agrarian, very homestead. Ironic, because he was none of those things. He was rich, he was white, he was an aristocrat. He owned, I think Monticello was something like 5,000 acres, and he owned something like 100 slaves. So I personally find it a little ironic that these were the things he said would make a strong America when he did basically none of them. This is going to become really important too as we get deeper into the economy of the early United States. He believed that strongly believed that the Hamiltonian system would create a powerful aristocracy, which would become so strong that it would upend the United States both politically and socially until it was nearly indistinguishable from the countries in Europe. And there's certainly an argument to be had about how true or false that is. And again, it's also rather ironic because he was that landed aristocracy.
Yeah, he was.
You did it too.
I did it too. But yeah, he was one of those guys.
Yeah. And one of the more important differences, at least it's going to become more important as we go on, in addition to the other things, is that Jefferson firmly believed in conducting trade with coinage that had a specific value, i.e. gold, silver, heretofore referred to as specie. He didn't like the concept of paper money. And it made a lot of sense within the context of the period because, this was, 1787, 1788, into the early 1790s. The Revolutionary War had only ended in 1783. And the very first crisis that the fledgling United States encountered was the fact that the paper money that the Continental Congress produced during the war to pay the soldiers, to pay the merchants, to pay France and Spain for their help. By the mid-1780s, just a few years after the Revolutionary War ended, it wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. It was worthless. And so Jefferson saw that, went through it, lived it, and then went, no, paper money is a fool's errand. We need to conduct our trade in specie. We need to conduct our trade in something real, something tangible, So that was very much his belief. And there were a lot of people within the federal government, a lot of the founding fathers themselves, people like James Madison, who was one of the architects of the Constitution, would later become president. James Monroe, same deal, one of the architects of the Constitution, would later become president. These guys were devoutly Democratic Republicans, and believed that Jefferson had the right idea. And so, on the flip side of that coin,
Before we get to the flip side of that coin, some things in the studio I got to take care of real quick, so we're going to take a 1-second break, our first ever.
ooh,
And we're back! Hope you guys enjoyed your break.
yeah, that was a lengthy 1 second. Time dilation, it moved faster for you guys observing than it did for us, relativity.
That's another podcast.
Okay, so before we get back into this, I do want to address something. In the last episode, some of the more keen-eyed listeners, y'all are just, unless you're really good. But some of our more keen-eyed viewers may have realized that this time around I'm looking down at my notes a lot more. And the reason for that is the specifics of the American economy in the early 19th century and the late 18th century, the very, very beginning, has never... It's something I've learned about. It's something that I've read about, but it never really caught my eye too much. I've never really been like...
An economist?
Yeah, I've never really been an economist. So when I was researching for this episode and writing my notes out, to a very large degree, I was also learning the material. So the reason I'm looking down at my notes so much is because this is an aspect of early American history that I'm not very well versed in. And so, for those of you watching, I do apologize that I'm not, looking up as much. But because I'm not as familiar with this material as I am with the other topics that we've already discussed and that we're going to discuss, I want to make sure I don't get it wrong.
As our friends across the pond would say, needs must.
Exactly. So, that out of the way, we left off closing out the primary tenets of the Jeffersonian system with his systems heavily favoring trade in specie. Now, on the flip side of that coin, you have Alexander Hamilton, where Jefferson was a Virginian aristocrat. Hamilton was Rocky Balboa. Hamilton was the hard scrabble, born with nothing, raised with nothing, only achieved as much as he did because of determination, guile, and natural intelligence.
And his own hard work?
And his own hard work, very much so. So Hamilton, by contrast, believed in a very strong central government. He believed that a strong manufacturing base was the key to the country's growth. That was where the United States was going to make a name for itself on the world stage. It was manufacturing. It was industry. He valued American agriculture as an industry. He didn't completely discount and discredit the American farmers and frontiersmen and the planters, but he viewed them as a part of the whole. He didn't view them as the goal.
So he saw them as a necessary part of a larger system.
Correct. And he pushed very strongly for a national bank, a centralized bank that would not only provide capital to manufacturers and industrialists and capitalists, but would also facilitate that growth into the future, and the bank would be the mechanism that drove that growth. And he was strongly backed, as Jefferson was strongly backed by the agrarian class, predominantly Southern planters. Hamilton was strongly backed by the industrialist, predominantly Northern capitalists. And where Jefferson was, for all intents and purposes, the founder of the Democratic Republican Party, Alexander Hamilton, for all intents and purposes, was the founder of the Federalist Party. And both of those, as I said previous, were not explicitly a thing until after like 1796. You know, George Washington leaves office, John Adams comes in, first peaceful transfer of power within a government as far as they knew in world history. And it went smoothly. And then they just abandoned George Washington's no political parties thing altogether. And it was like, nah. Been fun, Georgie. Appreciate all the work you did, but I don't like that guy. You know, basically.
Which, ironically, is the system actually working as intended.
Yeah, kinda. But we're going to get in, as we go through, we're going to see how George Washington's, the idea of George Washington's decree that political parties not be a thing, while perhaps counter to human nature, and even perhaps counter to a Republican system, we're going to kind of see how he kind of called it. He kind of called it from the very beginning.
Yeah, I didn't mean to say that his idea was without merit. I'm just, I mean that the peaceful transfer of power and the next guy being able to undo everything the last guy did is difficult for us to deal with today and very inconvenient at times, but it is actually how the system was designed to work.
Largely, yeah. And to that point, too, as we get further into this topic, we're going to see how not only does it actively hurt us in the modern day, it actively caused a lot of problems from the beginning. But getting back on topic, the Hamiltonian system, if you go and open up like a book of economics nowadays, or after Hamilton, it wasn't called this. It wasn't called this by his contemporaries, but it starting from like the end of the first quarter of the 19th century onward, the Hamiltonian system is also called the American School of Economics, because it is, while it's not purely all Hamilton, a lot of the tenets of his system made it into the American system. But at the time, it was largely just referred to as like either the Hamiltonian system or the Federalist system. It, as I said earlier, it heavily favored the growth of industry, and export trade. Heavily emphasized export trade with minimal imports. Strongly opposed the concept of free trade. Under the Hamiltonian system, domestic industries need to be protected from foreign competition by protective tariffs. And there's a lot of them. We're going to go into those. But his exact words were infant industries, meaning, industries that the country did not have during the colonial period that it now needed and should have as a member of the developed world. Those needed to be protected from foreign competition at all cost. So the Hamiltonian system was heavily in favor of protective tariffs. Heavily favored a strong federal government. Specifically, I'm going to say Federalists. It's just easier at this point. Hamiltonian's a mouthful. You guys all know I'm talking about Hamilton and his systems. I'm going to say Federalist. Federalists believed it was the responsibility of the government to fund internal improvement projects. Well, that sounds kind of vague. What is that? Well, at the time, that's improvement of road networks, of canal networks, anything infrastructure that could be used to conduct and facilitate interstate commerce, domestic interstate commerce. Federalists firmly believed that if it was left to the states to do that, you would end up with a bunch of competing systems that were very likely to be incompatible with each other. And as a result, it would be very difficult to make money and grow the economy. So the federal government should step in and finance those internal improvement projects. It started with roads and canals and the like, and as technology improved, as steam-powered railroads became a thing, because there had been railroads for a long time by this point. It was just they were pulled by horses, and they weren't nearly as big. It was like a canal, but on land, and it was pulled by a horse or a team of horses. The steam-powered rail locomotive was a much more recent invention. I think early 18th century was when the first prototype became a thing, and it really didn't become in the United States. It started becoming a thing in the late 1820s, early 1830s.
Yeah, that's what I was going to mention as a parallel is when you mentioned that the concern was having competing systems that aren't intercompatible is like European rail gauge. Perfect example of that.
Yeah. Admittedly, I'm not super well versed in it in the modern day. But I have at least heard of it.
Yeah, in the early 20th century, there was many different rail gauges. Each country developed their own rail network, and there was no standardization. So, famously in World War II, one of the issues of moving stuff around, the Germans had a really big issue with this when they went into Russia, but similarly, there were issues as Allied forces were moving around, is you would show up to the country you're invading with all of your rail coming behind you, and all of a sudden, your trains don't fit on the country's tracks that you're trying to invade. And you have to unload everything from your trains and capture their trains and then put your stuff on their trains to move it around.
Yeah. It's really annoying.
Yeah, big nightmare.
And that's the problem in the late 18th century, early 19th century, that the Federalists sought to avoid by having it be the responsibility of the federal government to not only fund those things, but regulate those things. And the Federalists kind of took it one step further. They didn't just want to stop at regulating public infrastructure. They also wanted to regulate private infrastructure, private roads, private canals, because it could all be used for commerce, so it should all be the same standard. That was very much the Federalist platform on that. Federalists also said the government needs to create a national centralized bank, like I talked about a little bit earlier. And this bank should also issue a universal paper currency. And the idea wasn't to make the currency that trade was conducted in less reliable or less valuable. The idea, once again, like with the internal improvement projects, was to standardize it. That way, if you're a merchant in New York and you're purchasing Georgia cotton for your overseas customer, you don't have to pay that Georgia planter in
Georgia bucks.
in Georgia dollars. You just pay them in federal banknotes, and that federal banknote is as good in New York City as it is in Atlanta, Georgia, or, Savannah, Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, wherever that guy is. So again, it's this theme of the federal government standardizing things internally to facilitate domestic economic growth.
So I don't want to jump ahead too far, but just let me know if I'm kind of thinking down the right track here.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like at the end of the day, the Federalists won, because our system sounds a lot more like that. It also occurs to me that the North won. Seems like those two may be connected.
There's
I'm sure it's a very simplified version of the history that we're going to cover, but I think that's,
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, you're not wrong. As I was doing all the research for this, I started getting the same impression that, I'm looking at both of these systems, the Jeffersonian system and the Federalist system, and it was really obvious to me that there were bits and pieces of both that are still a part of our economic system today in the United States. From the Federalist side, in the modern day, we have there's a very strong emphasis on the acquisition of capital. Capital is the name of the game. If you're not making money, you're not playing the game. That is very much the foundation of our current economic system.
One might call it capitalist.
Yeah, precisely. But then too, you have the juxtaposition, especially now, in the modern 21st century. You see hints of this Jeffersonian call for rugged individualism. The phrase we would use today is pull yourself up by your bootstraps, which we all understand. If you think about that for more than 2 seconds, it's not possible. You can't pull yourself up physically by your own bootstraps. Physics doesn't work that way. But that's very much what we're being told now, and have been told probably for the last, 60 years or so, is that rugged individualism is going to win the day, even though it's been shown repeatedly that that's not actually how it works. You're more likely to win the capitalist game if you're born like Thomas Jefferson than you are if you're born like Alexander Hamilton, at least in the modern day. So yeah, there's a lot of things from both that are present in our current system, but you're also not wrong that by and large the Federalist system won out. Which to me at least, this is strictly my opinion, but that's why it's called the American School of Economics. That's why the Federalist system is talked about in the same conversation as the American School of Economics, because by and large, that's what our economic system is it's the Federalist system with some Jeffersonian stuff thrown in. Usually the Jeffersonian stuff is thrown in to make the working classes feel a little more important. Again, just my opinion, but as I was doing the research for this topic, that's very much the sense that I was getting. And it feels a little weird, honestly, learning about this and seeing that a lot of the problems that have happened within our generation's living memory. And by living memory, what I mean is not just us, ourselves, but the people we're able to talk to, our parents, our grandparents, and fewer and fewer of our cases nowadays, at least our great-grandparents. That's living memory. The memories that you can access by talking to somebody. So even within our own living memory, there are examples of where this system failed. And we're gonna go into it more, but the thing about the Federalist system is it is very much boom and bust, because you can't have an economy that is able to grow, especially in a global market, that is solely based around like protective tariffs. You can't have an economy that is able to grow where there's only one central bank and it controls everything. Okay, yes, you technically can, but you're not going to grow as quickly. On the flip side of that coin, take the Jeffersonian system. No bank regulations, no trade regulations. It's pure free trade, laissez-faire economics from the top down. That system has its own pitfalls, where if you are purely that, you're not going to grow very quickly, if you grow at all. Because this is where I do tend to personally favor the Federalist system a little bit more than the Jeffersonian, in that when capital's the name of the game and the idea is to make money and that's it, when you remove regulation from that conversation, when you remove oversight, you get a system that is perfect for exploitation. Even in a free trade economy where there's no tariffs coming in, anything like that, you're still left with a system where a select few are going to exercise the fact they have fewer scruples than anybody else around them, and they're going to use it to make themselves extraordinarily wealthy. That can happen under the Federalist system too. Neither of them are perfect. But all of that to say that there's really no such thing as a perfect system. And the one thing that history has definitely shown, and that we're going to still talk about, is how the American system of the American School of Economics truly is a boom and bust system. There will be a few decades of prosperity and rapid growth, and innovation, and then it's all going to come crashing down. And then it'll level out, and then it'll grow again, and then it'll crash back down. It is a cycle that has repeated ever since the country was founded. So it's more interesting to me now that I've actually had to go through and like learn all of this for doing research for this episode than it was when I was naturally exposed to all of these things. But you know, all of that to say, bringing it back to what we're actually supposed to be talking about. The early United States, the first, 20 years currently, not the first 20 years of the 21st century. No, the first 20 years of the United States. The primary plank of the Federalist system was this standardization to promote domestic commerce by a strong federal government.
And that's one thing I wanted to ask you about is we have a very particular connotation or meaning when we use the term regulation. In the modern context, regulation is kind of a four-letter word, or it's used as one by political pundits. So it sounds like the Federalist system is more about standardization than it is about really any other thing that you may want to regulate for. So is it a case where it's not so much that you're asking the federal government, mommy, daddy, may I please build a bridge? It's more so, hey, I'm going to build a bridge, and they say, okay, well, make sure, it can take this much weight or whatever the standardization is.
Yeah, it's largely more that. I mean, if you just think about the word regulate, the verb, right? It doesn't mean legislate. What it means is to control a rate of change, right? It's a check valve on a pipe, or a pressure relief valve. Those are regulators. They regulate the system they're a part of. And so when the Federalists said regulation, said the federal government needed to regulate these things, it wasn't
literally to keep it regular.
Right. It wasn't the federal government needs to pass all this legislation, blah, 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 blah. But what the federal government needs to have the authority to do is to go to Philadelphia and say to, the governor of Pennsylvania, hey, all of your bridges are a foot too narrow. We can't, wagons can't easily get through here without interchanging onto a Pennsylvania-built wagon. You need to widen your bridges. And then the federal government provides the capital to do that. That when the Federalists are talking about regulation, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about the federal government needs to establish a set of standards for everybody to follow, all of the states to follow, and then where necessary, provide the funding to meet those standards, to have those building projects to meet those standards. It's a lot of that. At least one of the connections that I made is that a lot of the precedent cited by FDR as part of the New Deal programs were these Federalist ideas, these things that were done and talked about in the early 19th century was, hey, I'm not going to say by law you have to do this. All I'm saying is I'm going to pay you to fix this. You just have to fix it my way. You fix it my way, I'm going to foot the bill. And so that's largely what it was. And it was actually Hamilton, in his capacity as the first Secretary of the Treasury, that got the first Bank of the United States chartered in 1791. He was able to get it approved by the new Congress, and so, the country became a thing in 1788. That was when George Washington was elected to his first term as president. And by 1791, we had the first Bank of the United States, a centralized bank that would fulfill these Federalist requirements. And the bank was given a charter for 20 years. That's going to become relevant. An important thing that people really need to understand about this period in history is any of the taxes that you can think of right now that you pay as an individual, none of them existed. There was no income tax, there was no luxury tax, there was no property tax. None of those taxes existed. So how did the federal government make its money? It made its money on imports. Import tariffs. That's how the federal government made its money. Customs duties. And private investors could buy like shares of the first Bank of the United States, and that would bring, money into the federal government as well. But by and large, there weren't a lot of taxes. So the federal government, while the federal government under the Constitution was stronger than it was under the Articles of Confederation, and it had largely solved the issue of, is the government allowed to levy taxes on the states? Under the Constitution, the answer is yes. Under the Articles of Confederation, the answer was no, which is another big reason why that system failed. But so the federal government could levy taxes on the states. At this time, though, it largely didn't. Again, because the incidents leading up to the Revolutionary War were still within living memory by 1800. Right? This was only 38 years after I think it was the Stamp Act in 1762. Somebody's going to correct me on that off the top of my head. It was sometime around there, 62, 63. Either way, we're only like 37, 38 years removed from that. So the people that lived through that aren't old necessarily. And then too, the complete failure that was the Articles of Confederation from 1783 to 1787, that is also still within generational memory by 1800. Forget living memory. That's still fresh in the minds of the people that are currently in government because they were currently in government then. So the federal government still doesn't really levy taxes on the states or on individuals. So the bulk of its money comes from taxing imports. And it's kind of interesting that it's around 1800 that the line between Federalists and Jeffersonians, between Federalists and Democratic Republicans, starts to blur as far as the economy goes, because the decade previous, the 1790s, kind of metered out or proved out sort of what Hamilton was talking about. And even at this early stage, the population of the North was growing faster than the population of the South was. So the Democratic Republicans kind of started realizing by 1800, we need to start adapting some of these policies or we're never getting elected again.
Because they're working.
Right, exactly. So some of the planks. Oh, so side note, planks. Back in the day, if you were campaigning,
Really, really small distances.
no, not a plank length. Back in the day, if you were campaigning, you built your own platform. And this is the 19th century. What's your platform made out of? It's made out of wood. Wooden planks specifically. And what campaigners would do was they would write on these planks what their big, keystone things were. The things they were going to do if they were
Their
elected.
hashtags.
Basically. So, it just kind of turned into a colloquialism, when you say, one of the planks of this or that. It, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is what I learned, at least. Maybe it was apocryphal, but that came from it literally being a plank on your campaign platform. So yeah, fun little sidebar. So some of the planks that the Democratic Republicans adopted from the Federalists, or adapted, I guess, would make a little more sense. Either or. The acceptance of protective tariffs as pragmatic economic policy. And I'm going to blow through some of these because I go into them in much more detail later. So, I'm not skipping over important things to minimize them. I'm skipping over it because I know for a fact there's a lot more detail down the line. The Democratic Republicans recognized the need for a central bank. They saw the benefits that it was having on the early United States. Tolerance of paper money. Federally funded internal improvement projects being necessary for specific industries, or certain industries, rather. Expansion of national territory was very much, kind of a Federalist thing. Grow. And so, that's how you end up with things like the Louisiana Purchase in 1805, where Jefferson, who was president at the time, he was a Democratic Republican, right? Like I said, he's the one who started it. That gave us, parts of Louisiana, all of Arkansas, Missouri, parts of Oklahoma, all of Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, South Dakota, parts of Texas, and Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, Minnesota. Huge chunk of land.
And Queen, somebody of someplace got screwed.
Napoleon. We bought it from Napoleon.
Wild Wild West.
Oh, yeah. Fantastic film. Can't believe I didn't get that right away. But anyway, so, so there's the Louisiana Purchase. 1811, the United States annexes West Florida. Now, it's not the Panhandle. West Florida was actually just like, I guess it'd be over here. For you guys looking at Louisiana, it was like the top, central eastern part, like the toe part of the boot of Louisiana, like those six parishes or whatever. The U.S. just straight up annexed it. Just sent the army in, like, this is ours now. Who was president at the time? James Madison, another Democratic Republican, another founding father. Then we have the War of 1812. At the end of the war, the Treaty of Ghent, which was the treaty signed in 1814 in Ghent, that ended the War of 1812 between the United States and Great Britain. That gained us the Oregon Territory and established the American border with British Canada along the 49th parallel. That went into effect in 1818. And the chunk of territory, I say Oregon Territory, but it wasn't just Oregon. At the time, that chunk of territory included Oregon, obviously, the state of Washington and the state of Idaho. That was the Oregon Territory. And then we have the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1818. And that, when that went into effect, it was initially negotiated by John Quincy Adams, who was the son of John Adams, second president of the United States. John Quincy Adams was his son, would eventually become president later on. At this time, he wasn't president, he was Secretary of State. But he negotiated this treaty with Spain it was negotiated 1818, went into effect 1821, and that gave the United States the rest of Florida. So the Panhandle, the peninsula, all of it. And at the time when he did this, he was a Democratic Republican. John Quincy Adams is actually kind of funny because his father, John Adams, was a staunch Federalist. And in the beginning, John Quincy was also a staunch Federalist. Then he decided he really wanted to, be involved. So he became a Democratic Republican. And then, later, in the 1830s, when the Democratic Republican Party fractured, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I don't remember how much I have on that specifically, but it did happen. He went with the faction that would become the Whigs. So he's a bit of a political chameleon.
Well-traveled.
Yes, he's very well-traveled. And then we have we have the Mexican-American War, 1845 to 1848. A bit of a time skip there, but, that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was the treaty that ended that war, essentially finished out the territory of the contiguous United States as it is today. That gave us basically everything else except for a very small strip of Arizona and New Mexico that we purchased shortly thereafter, and historically it's known as the Gadsden Purchase. But all of that to say, all of these presidents that presided over territorial expansion, these were all Democratic Republicans. These were all people who believed in getting as much land as possible, because the Democratic Republicans and the Democrats that they eventually became after the split, they never fully lost sight of their whole, rugged individualism, hard scrabble, value of the American farmer thing. And so it was land. And what did that eventually end up being, especially for the Democrats? Land for slaves, land for slaves, land for slavery, land for slavery. That's what it kind of turned into, but it struck me as interesting that the major territorial acquisitions that happened in the early United States were all from one specific party and not the one that started out with the desire for a strong federal government, but one that adopted it and then kind of took it and ran with it, basically. So that was a lot, and there's a lot more to go. I don't know. Are we going to be able to do this in one episode?
I don't think we're going to be able to do it in one episode. I know we do have some time constraints, so we can split it whenever we need to. Which I would be happy to just run and then just chop it in post.
Oh man. Okay, yeah. For the record, if we decide to leave this little sidebar in, I'm about a third of the way down.
Yeah, there's a lot.
There's so much.
You want to take another?
Yeah, let's take another 1 second break.
And we're back. Hope you enjoyed your break.
Nope. Okay. So, we left off on territorial expansion. Now, I want to start talking a bit about some of the things that were happening within the economy in the early 19th century at this point. So, well, I guess I've kind of been doing that all along. God damn it. Anyway, so in 1807, Europe is in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars. No, I guess it's kind of the beginning, middle, whatever. Napoleonic Wars are a thing in Europe. And in keeping with George Washington's policy of strict neutrality, the United States has continued that. And so in 1807, Congress passed the Embargo Act of 1807. They were clever namers of things. I don't know what the word is for that. Whatever. It's probably something that's...
Nameology.
Nameology. It's probably some awful mix of Latin and Greek. But basically what the Embargo Act did was it restricted trade with both England and France. And it was meant to demonstrate the United States' neutrality, which on the Federalist side was kind of a good thing. American industries were at less risk of being outcompeted by British manufacturers who, frankly, had been doing it longer and could do it cheaper. On the other hand, there wasn't as much global trade, so the federal government wasn't able to make as much money on imports. So, bit of a two-edged sword. And then, in 1811, the First Bank of the United States' charter, its 20-year charter, is up. And the bill to reissue the charter gets before President James Madison, who's a Democratic Republican, and he does not allow the First Bank of the United States to renew its charter. So what does that mean? Well, that effectively ended federal influence in the regulation of state banks at the time. It really allowed state banks across the United States to adopt laissez-faire financial principles, and it basically became the financial Wild West. And these...
Is this a return to Georgia bucks?
This is very much a return to Georgia bucks. I mean, Georgia bucks were still a thing, even under the First Bank of the United States. It was just what a state bank could and could not do was regulated by the First Bank of the United States. So, lines of credit. How much credit could you issue against the specie that you had in reserve? Things like that. The First Bank of the United States put limits on for these state banks. Well, now it's 1811, the charter's up. President Madison doesn't renew it. doesn't allow it to be renewed, strikes it down, doesn't have enough support in the legislature to override his decision. And
Okay, so the Congress passed the bill and he vetoed it.
right. And then Congress, there wasn't enough support in Congress to override the veto, so the charter was not renewed. And what these state banks basically started doing was they took the Jeffersonian tenet of rugged individualism and basically said, land speculation is just rugged individualism. Buying and selling land on credit, with basically nothing to back it up. That's just how you look, take care of yourself and provide for yourself. And, this frontier, mental gymnastics galore. But that's basically what happened. And I mean, the number of state chartered banks exploded. I mean, in 1811, there were 88 state banks, 88 state chartered banks in the United States.
Divided over how many states at that time?
Oh, crap. I want to say somewhere around 20. It sounds close enough to right.
20-ish.
20-ish. Yeah. Look, in 1811 there is somewhere between 13 and 50 states. The number isn't all that important within this context, the number of states. What's important is
I'm just curious, like, a given state would have about how many state banks?
Oh, I'm not even sure about that, to be honest. There was a higher density in the north versus the south, and a higher density in the east versus the west. But I have no idea what the average would have been.
Yeah, it would just be 88 divided by the number of states.
I suppose in post I'll actually do the math and, we'll throw it up on the screen, or I'll talk about it at the start of the next episode or something. Anyway, 1811, 88 state banks, state chartered banks. In 1815, there were 208 state chartered banks, each of them with their own currency, each of them with their own specie reserve, each of them issuing their own bonds, and with the federal government, now that it no longer has a centralized bank to use for, government payroll, the collection of import customs duties, any taxes that are levied. Now that it no longer has that central pot, it gets spread out to all these state banks.
It makes me think that the idea of starting with a 20-year charter was bad.
The 20-year thing was a compromise.
Naturally.
Because you have to remember, the Democratic Republicans did not want this to happen.
I think we're just going to have to start calling that the C word.
The one that ends in Tuesday?
Compromise?
Oh, that. Yep. Look, man, you said the C word. That's the C word I think of when someone says C word.
My point is, everything horrible that happened because of a series of compromises.
Yeah.
Moving on.
So, in addition to the federal government now being forced to go to all these state banks, in order to deposit its funds and withdraw its, expenditures, the federal government actually leveraged the fact that all of these completely unregulated state banks were playing fast and loose with lines of credit to fund the War of 1812. They did that specifically to ensure they could keep getting credit. One consequence of this, the amount of paper currency in circulation exploded. With that tends to go inflation. Past a certain point. Once the amount of currency, paper currency, exceeded the specie in reserve, then you start getting inflation. And one of the results of the federal government doing this is it resulted in most of the specie that was available being sequestered away from these state banks and put into the hands of New England moneylenders. And these moneylenders were notoriously conservative with their issuance of lines of credit. They didn't like doing it. And so, now the federal government finds itself in a bit of a pickle, right? It still needs more credit. The war's still going on. It still has to fund it. But, there's no specie in reserve anymore. Most of it's been passed around so many times. Now it's in the hands of people that don't want to put it at risk. So what does the federal government do? Well, it basically suspended the requirements for these state banks to make payments to these New England lenders in specie. It basically said, hey, guess what? You can use banknotes to pay these loans to these lenders. And it basically enabled the federal government to continue to easily procure lines of credit to continue to fund the war. And at the time, this was seen as okay. It's a wartime measure. We have to fund the war. We have to be able to pay our troops. We have to, buy arms and ammunition. We got to build ships. So this was seen as just a natural wartime measure. The problem is, when the Treaty of Ghent was signed in 1814, these policies and practices didn't go away. They didn't undo them right away.
That's how you get Caesar.
So, these state banks continued to turn massive profits from lending without any regard for whether or not they had enough specie in reserve to actually support the loans, because they didn't have to. And naturally, the bubble that formed from this was essentially a ticking time bomb strapped to the economy. This was never gonna end well. There's no version of this that ends well for the United States economy. And some people within the government weren't oblivious to this fact. These aren't idiots. These aren't uneducated people. These are very intelligent people that, are the same. They're the same as you and I. They're looking at this situation. They're looking at the facts, and they're making the same connections we are. You completely deregulated the banks. You allowed them to pay back their loans with paper currency, and you allowed them to keep issuing lines of credit that they don't actually have the gold and silver in reserve to back up. This isn't going to end well. They could see that too. And so the Federalists within the government, and it's worth mentioning that by 1814, the Federalist faction, we'll say, Federalist Party, was long since in steep decline. because they no longer really had the edge over the Democratic Republicans. The Democratic Republicans had adopted half of their platform, basically. So they didn't really have the edge anymore. They were already in steep decline, but what Federalist elements were still there began calling for the reestablishment of a central bank. They saw the writing on the wall. They saw the bubble was forming. They knew it was going to burst eventually. And they're like, hey, we need to reestablish a central bank to pull these state banks back into line. The economy is going to implode if we don't. Some of the what this really led into was the transformation, more or less the official transformation from this Hamiltonian versus Jeffersonian economic system into the American school of economics, the American system. This in 1814 to 1815, this is where that economic school really takes its shape. And the idea was that it would be this blending of Hamiltonian capitalism with Jeffersonian rugged individualism. They would take the best parts of these two systems and put them together and save the country from economic ruin. And the largest proponents of this, the two most prominent, neo-federalists, air quotes, were Henry Clay of Kentucky. He was a Democratic Republican, technically, but he was also Speaker of the House at the time. Maybe one day, in one episode, just for fun, as a one-off, we'll talk about Henry Clay, because he's oh my God, he is to the early 19th century America. He is to early 19th century America what Ralph Nader was to late 20th century America. This was a man who was buried up to his neck in policy. He was prominent behind the scenes, and he kept wanting to be president, and it never worked out. Ever. It'd be sad if it wasn't so funny. But, maybe one day we'll do a one-off on Henry Clay, but, he was from Kentucky. He was from the frontier. He believed in the Jeffersonian agrarian thing, but he was also pragmatic, and he saw the necessity of the Hamiltonian system. So, at the end of the War of 1812 and 1814, he was one of the big people in government, saying, hey, this disaster is on the horizon, let's fix it by blending these two economic systems together. Incidentally, he never became president, but he did make it to vice president at least once. But I don't remember off the top of my head who the president was. But anyway, the other prominent neo-federalist is a man who we are certainly going to talk about down the line, because he just became a royal pain in the ass. Is John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. He was vice president under Quincy Adams and Jackson. He was a congressman at this time. At the end of the War of 1812, he was just a congressman, but under John Quincy Adams and then under Andrew Jackson, he would be vice president. So these are the guys, the primary guys. There were others, but these are the primary guys that are like, hey, we need this, American system to save us. Well, you being the resident libertarian, you might actually enjoy this part. It was not the government that ended up saving the government's bacon at the end of the War of 1812. It was private capital. 3 prominent Democratic Republicans. They weren't in the government at all. These are private citizens. These are capitalists, financiers. Stephen Girard, John Jacob Astor, and David Parrish collectively purchased all $16 million of federal war bonds and single-handedly saved the nation from bankruptcy.
In $1815.
In $1815. I don't know off the top of my head how much that is. I think it's somewhere north of like $500 million today. Maybe closer to $1 billion than to 500 million. But 3 men saved the country from bankruptcy, basically. Stephen Girard was actually born in France in 1750. He moved to the U.S. during the colonial period, became a banker, and at the time of his death in 1831, he was the wealthiest man in the country. It wasn't even close. Him alone, of the 3, he was by far the wealthiest. He single-handedly financed 95% of that $16 million war debt. John Jacob Astor. Some of you guys may recognize that name from the movie Titanic, because it was one of his descendants, John Jacob Astor the third, I think, who was still horrifically wealthy, still an industrialist, and died on the Titanic. Anyway, back to John Jacob Astor Senior. He was actually born in Germany in 1763. Well, now it's Germany. Then the part of Germany he was born in was part of the Holy Roman Empire. But he made his fortune by obtaining a monopoly on the fur trade in the Northwest Territories. And he later took that money and began speculating on real estate in New York City. And then he took that money. He decided it wasn't quite enough. So he started illegally smuggling Ottoman-produced opium into China. Made a lot of money on that. But then when the Royal Navy got, like, all square about it and, like, started cracking down on the illegal opium smuggling, he just started selling it straight to Britain. Legally. So that Britain could send it to China. And he still made obscene amounts of money. Yeah. I thought that was a little, when I learned that, like, oh,
great. Wow, that's so much better. Thanks, England. You guys, you did a good job.
Yeah, well, more so. Oh, one of the guys that saved the United States was a drug smuggler. Huh.
I was going to blow past that part.
Not me. And then the last of the trio, a man named David Parrish, born in Hamburg in 1778. Before I read the rest of, his little spiel, I found it very interesting that three of the wealthiest men in America in 1815 who bailed out the federal government, none of them were even born on the same continent as the United States. I found that actually kind of interesting.
It's an interesting thought. I think there's probably a couple of reasons for that.
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, what are we talking? 1815, 1816?
Yeah, I mean, at that time, a large proportion of the American population was comprised of immigrants.
Yeah, exactly. People who had come over during the colonial period, were born in England, born in Germany, born in Scotland or Ireland, and came over here when it was still a collection of British colonies.
And since you outed me as a libertarian,
you outed yourself in the first episode, you knucklehead.
Okay, that sounds right. So...
Oh, no, please.
I was just going to say, I would like to think that one of the reasons that it was a trio of immigrants that decided to bail out the federal government is because, having come from Europe, they were like, this is a system that we don't want to fall apart because, it offers something that is unique.
I could see that. I could see an argument being made for that.
I mean, yeah, it worked out fabulously well for those three guys. They're like, came here, I don't know if they were from rich families or whatever.
Universally.
Yeah, of course. But they're like, we came here and look how much money we made. We really don't want this to be like Germany. We want it to be like what it is, where we're making all this money.
Right. Yeah, and, there's nothing in life that's free. Everything comes at some kind of cost. I am fairly certain as well that the motivations of these three men were not entirely altruistic, that they did see this as a way to continue to amass wealth. And for one of them, it certainly panned out that way. Stephen Girard, like I said, he died the wealthiest man in America. And as a matter of fact, the bank that he had founded in Philadelphia, it actually fell apart, ironically enough, after his death. But several other prominent financiers in Philadelphia sought to capitalize on the fame and prestige of his name by starting I didn't actually put this in my notes. Now I'm strictly going off memory. I believe it was the Girard Bank and Trust Company, which eventually just kind of became the Girard Bank. And that institution was around until, I believe, 1988, when it was bought by Citizens Bank. So...
Did pretty well.
Yeah. But last couple of things about David Parrish. So born in Hamburg, 1778. If I said 6 the last time, sorry, misread it. 78. Moved to the United States in 1806. And he made his fortune in land speculation and as a merchant on the northern border with British Canada, buying and selling goods across that border. That's where he made his fortune from. He actually became an American citizen in 1816, and in 1819 he was named the American consul in Antwerp, Belgium, and he served in that role from 1819 to 1823, and then he passed away like 3 years later. That particular part isn't strictly relevant, but you know, that's a thing that happened. But yeah, so, you know, we come to the end of the war, and the federal government has a lot of debt that's going to be coming due, and 3 capitalists Hamiltonian at heart, basically bailed the government out. So, kind of funny there. But I think that's a good place to stop for this episode, because we have a lot more to cover. We're now about halfway down my notes.
Yeah. And now's the point at which we start to go into detail on all of the things that you've previously said. We'll go into detail on that more later.
Yeah. A lot of the protective tariffs, how they were envisioned, how they were implemented, how the United States navigated this whole we don't have a central bank and our state banks are running around like kids hopped up on too much sugar. What do we do? How are we going to fix this? That's all yet to be discussed. And in the interest of time, to prevent this episode from being 2.5 hours plus, I think this is a good place to stop. Hopefully, though, rather than do the usual thing where we're dropping a new episode every week or 2 weeks, hopefully we'll be able to drop part 1 and 2 here at the same time. So for you guys listening, for you guys watching, not really going to be a huge difference. It'll just be 2 different episodes technically, but recording takes time.
It does.
And editing takes time. And I mean, I don't have to do it, but he does.
It takes my time.
And I am a kind and considerate person. Therefore, I think this is probably a good place to stop.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thank you all for joining us. As Steve just mentioned, the following episode, we're going to continue this discussion and wrap this up before moving on to the next subject. And these 2 episodes should drop concurrently, so if you are out of your mind and want to listen to both of them back to back, that should be an option for you. So we'll talk to you then.
See ya.